I would say we start.
Okay, hello everyone. I spelled my name wrong, and we are very proud to present our webinar participants today that about NECT and self-stigma. And please go ahead.
Okay, so I will begin. So just first of all, the title of our talk is Introduction to Stigma, Self-Stigma, Background on NECT. So we're covering a wide area here. This is a little bit of my background. So my name is Philip Yanos. My early experiences were being around a state hospital here in New York City on an isolated place. So I've written a book about not just that experience, but about the place and what it's like now. It's called Exiles in New York City. I'm a practicing clinical psychologist. I work on something called an assertive community treatment team in the East Harlem neighborhood of Manhattan. My main job is I'm a psychology professor at a place called John Jay College. I serve as director of clinical training for our clinical PhD program. And I'm a stigma researcher, and I've written a book about stigma called Written Off: Mental Health Stigma and the Loss of Human Potential. And I'm an associate editor for a journal called Stigma and Health. So David will now introduce himself.
Yes, thank you. My name is David Roe. I was born in the United States and moved to Israel. And since then, I've been moving back and forth for periods of my life. At the moment, as mentioned earlier, I'm actually here in New York City on a sabbatical. I'm a professor at the University of Haifa in Israel. I'm a visiting professor this year at Rutgers University at New Jersey. I'm a clinical psychologist in training and have a small private practice and mostly work in conducting research and training, and as until recently the associate editor of the Journal of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and the associate editor of the Journal of Mental Health.
And we wanted to acknowledge our late collaborator, Paul Lysacker, without whom our work would not have been possible. And so a little bit of the story is I met David at Rutgers University in the early 2000s, and we had discussions around some of the ideas that led to this work that we're going to talk to you about today. And David had already made a connection with Paul, and Paul was definitely the key to opening up a lot of the work that we did. So David, would you like to say anything about?
Yeah, just to say that we have wonderful memories of Paul, who we greatly miss. He passed away suddenly about almost 3 years ago, and he's a very big loss to the many people who loved him and whose work and careers he facilitated so generously as a professional and as a person and close friend. And we had a very beautiful and enriching friendship and collaboration for over 2 decades. And so he's greatly missed and much appreciated.
Yes, and also some of this work was funded by parts of the United States government. So we also want to acknowledge that allowed it to happen. And that was our collaboration together that was supported. Okay, so the overview of the presentation is we're going to start with talking about recovery and stigma theory and how societal stigma becomes internalized stigma. We're going to talk about identity, how self-stigma damages a person's identity. Then we're going to talk about the intervention that we developed, narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy, a little bit about how it works, a little bit about its global reach and some of the research that we have on it. And then we hope that we'll have time for questions at the end. So we're going to do our best to stay on time with this. So we'll start out now. David is going to talk about recovery a little bit.
Yeah. The recovery is something that had enormous impact upon the whole way in which we capture and understand mental health and respond to it. And in a very nice conceptualization, which I'll briefly refer to, Mike Slade refers to 4 elements of it. The first is to learn how to better manage the illness. And that is an aspect of self-management, of being able to understand and cope with the illness. Part of it is valued and desired social roles, that recovery is not only about coping with the illness and managing it better, but actually acquiring valued social roles, which actually help the development of our identity and sense of self and sense of meaning, which is the next element that Mike Slade mentioned, and to establish a sense of a meaningful life, like most of us hope to and have a reason to wake up in the morning for. And finally, and what we'll be focusing on more today, is to develop a positive identity. And we'll be talking a lot about what happens to one's identity after being diagnosed with a serious mental illness and its impact. And NECT fits in effort to try to help recover one's identity and sense of self.
And so talking about stigma, stigma is a broad concept that includes much more than just the labeling of a characteristic, but that's really where it starts. And the best way that I have of explaining what stigma is that it's an umbrella term, and that includes multiple components of this process. So there's the attachment of negative stereotypes to an attribute. And so negative stereotypes that are attached to mental illness are expectations of violence, inability to recover, and incompetence. And this elicits responses from people in the community to people with the attribute. They engage in behaviors such as social avoidance or discrimination. And then the person with the attribute, their sense of who they are and how they expect to be viewed by others is impacted. And so these are all things that we're going to touch on to some extent in our review now. And it is important to note that stigma is still an important force in society. I don't know much about the current data in Sweden, but in the United States, we have evidence that there's actually been a small increase in endorsement of negative stereotypes and intended social distance toward people who meet criteria for schizophrenia. And there are a range of reasons for this that I won't be able to go into today. But it's a concerning thing, and it means basically that, stigma is not something of the past, as some people have suggested at times. The core of negative stereotypes about mental illness are these ones that were identified in this Stigma in a Global Context study that included people from 16 countries, and they were all endorsed by over 50% of people. So likely to be violent, not likely to be productive, unpredictable, and shouldn't care for children. So the main issue that we're thinking about with regard to the people that we're serving or the people that we are, I know ISPS has people with lived experience and people who are practitioners in it, is, are people aware of these negative stereotypes? And the overwhelming evidence is that yes, people are, and that they're concerned about them. So research finds that a majority of people diagnosed with mental health conditions are aware of stigma and anticipate discrimination, and believe that most people hold these views. This is interesting graph because this comes from Graham Thornycroft's work, because you can see here that the highest bar is anticipated and not experienced. So you don't have to experience discrimination to anticipate it. And the reason for that fits in with the modified labeling model that both David and I are inspired by, which is basically that we grow up absorbing these negative stereotypes. They are taught to us, not in a kind of direct way, but through the socialization process. And as a result, when we reach adulthood, we have a sense that these are things that are generally believed by people. So then if we become diagnosed, there becomes this moment of, oh no, these are about me now. So this is just a graph demonstrating how the modified labeling perspective works, is that you have a diagnosis and you're aware of negative stereotypes, and then they take on personal relevance and you become concerned about how they reflect upon you. Okay, so David's now going to talk about some of the sociological theories about how stigma gets transmitted.
Yeah, thank you. Bruce Link, who Phil just mentioned, was also a sociologist, and actually some of the most inspiring literature that helped understand stigma comes from sociologists. One, and for sure the most famous one, is Goffman, who described the contribution of the institutionalization process through stripping one from his own identity, and how institutions, in order to work effectively, try to strip people from any personal identities. For example, the way they have their hair, the clothes that they wear, specific behaviors of theirs. Perhaps the army is like a notable one in which an institution has very clear rules, some of which are directly aimed to try to decrease one's and limit one's identity in order to turn the person to a specific role that they are to fulfill. Sheff, another famous sociologist, talked about unwanted and deviant behaviors that were influencing labeling, referring to the social context in which labeling occurs and how the group which is in majority or alternatively holds most of the power uses these aspects of and defines what is unwanted behavior and what are the consequences of such behavior. And by doing so, they help identify those who are considered or thought to be not worthy to belong. Peggy Thoits, another influential sociologist, emphasized the aspect of social roles, arguing that the number of roles a person holds and the meaning they attribute to each role and the way they value their ability to fulfill that role has a profound impact on their sense of self and identity. And she described how people with serious mental illness often gradually or sometimes suddenly experience a considerable restriction in number of roles, and therefore their opportunity to feel as a complete person, to feel as active agents, is reduced to a small number of roles in which they may not necessarily also get feedback, which would be help them feel encouraged or feel good about themselves. And in fact, in extreme situations, as Sue Astroff, another medical anthropologist, described an I am illness, how a person gradually is in risk because of these processes described of limited opportunities and limited alternative social roles to the patient role and the patient identity. Their identity and sense of self becomes restricted and limited until they may be, as Lally points out, engulfed by the illness, in which the illness in some way takes over them and takes them captive.
So it's important to note that this is not an automatic process. And so our friend, our late friend, Pat Corrigan and Amy Watson developed a model for that there would be different possible responses to awareness of stigma among people who've been diagnosed. And so this is going to, elaborate on how this internalization or this taking on the identity is only one possible outcome. So one outcome that they identified was indifference. And so essentially, this would be the case where someone doesn't identify as a member of the group. Some professionals would see this as being the result of maybe having low insight and not accepting that you have a mental health condition. But it could also be just that someone sees themselves as somehow different from other people with that label. And as a result, their view is that it doesn't apply to me, it doesn't matter. Another possible outcome is what they identified as righteous anger. And in this case, people identify as a member of the group. Yes, I am a person who's been diagnosed this way, or I am a person with this condition. But they reject stereotypes and they see them as unjust. And I want to note that righteous anger is not a negative kind of anger. This could be a very empowered and engaged kind of anger that leads one to advocacy. And the last possible outcome is self-stigma. And so David will say a little bit more about how this fits in with some of the theories that he already discussed.
Which basically is the case in which a person also identifies strongly with a group, as Phil just explained, feels, yes, I'm part of this group of people who have a serious mental illness. But in this case, they have high perceived stereotype legitimacy in which they actually agree and adapt and internalize those negative stereotypes, hold against the group in which they view themselves and see themselves as part of. And once a person identifies with a group which they perceive and internalize as a stigmatized group, it leads to self-stigma, the process in which those negative social public stereotypes are internalized. This study is a study that we published about 20 years ago. And it's a study that was led by our late friend Paul Lysaker and was sort of a landmark in our thinking and influenced a lot of the way we understood these processes and consequently developed the intervention, which we'll be talking about, NECT, based on it. And the main finding of the study is that we had about 75 participants, which conducting some analysis called a cluster analysis, divided into 3 groups, which differed in their levels of insight. Now, insight is an interesting concept which has a long history and for the most part has been considered as very positive. This is not surprising because like in any other area in life, we often view insight or understanding having a problem as something which would almost be a prerequisite for coping with it, for seeking help for it. And therefore, it's easy to understand why insight is considered a positive thing. There's a lot of research also that shows that high insight is associated with many good outcomes. For example, fewer hospitalizations, better alliance, and so more adherence to treatment. And therefore, historically, insight was almost a desired goal in the mental health system. Now, despite its notable advantages, an important question when we think about insight is insight into what? What does it mean to have insight? And for the most part, insight has been perceived as realizing or acknowledging having symptoms and attributing those symptoms to psychiatric difficulties, as well as recognizing the need for treatment. Well, this may be of value for some, considering the considerable stigma that goes into having a mental illness. Expecting that one will accept and have insight into their illness is something that can challenge one's sense of self and value, because it's basically putting this label which carries so much stigma on who they are. And therefore, it's possible that for some people, rejecting that label may not be a sign of simple lack of insight or psychopathology, but rather almost a coping effort to sustain and protect one's sense of self. And in this study, we found, and empirically, that indeed insight was a good thing, but for some of the people, only for those who had low self-stigma, those who did not perceive the label of mental illness as having the implications that Phil described earlier, like being unpredictable necessarily, or violent, or never being able to have a productive life. For those people, high insight was not a good thing. However, for those who had low self-stigma, who did not internalize, were able to reject that self-stigma, insight was a good thing. That better outcomes. And so influenced by the findings of the study we published helped us appreciate and understand and think about the issue of how it must be important to first try to tackle and decrease self-stigma in order for people to begin to negotiate and think and explore what it means to have a label of mental illness and to negotiate the meaning it holds for them. So it really helped sharpen our thinking in terms of the sequence of things, rather than, as done traditionally, expecting first insight. We actually thought that it would be important to first try to decrease self-stigma. And we were very inspired and influenced by many of the writings of people with lived experience and people whom we had many discussions and interactions with. And one of them is Pat Deegan, who's probably one of the most famous and influential people with lived experience and is a clinical psychologist. And one of her who contributed greatly to the field through many ways, and originally from giving so much insight and inspiration and understanding of what recovery is. And one of her beautiful papers back from 1993, she writes, "I found myself wondering how those of us who have experienced being profoundly devalued as a result of being labeled with a mental illness move from thinking we have little or no value to discovering our own unique value. How do we reclaim and recover our sense of value when we have been devalued and dehumanized?" And that question is what directed the development of NECT as a sort of a transition, to put it in some superficial yet sort of easy to understand manner, a transition from the experience in which the mental illness is the dominant identity and sense of self, and the me, the who I am, is a small part, towards a transition in which I feel and experience myself first and foremost as a person, and the mental illness being a part, at times maybe a larger part or a smaller part, but just a part of my life and not defining me.
So just a summary of what we've covered so far before we get into talking about the intervention is that negative stereotypes are commonly endorsed by community members, with many people expecting violence. So stigma is still, prevalent, and many community members, again, these are based on the United States numbers, are intend social distance from people who've been diagnosed. People who've been diagnosed anticipate discrimination commonly, so are very aware of stigma. And roughly a third, based on most of the research that's been done, experience elevated self-stigma. Maybe if you broaden the sense of what can constitute significant self-stigma, it could be higher, up to 75%. And that it's associated with a range of negative outcomes related to recovery, which we've done a bunch of research on that we don't have time to get into here. So all of this creates justification for an intervention. And so one of the things I want to note is that when we started working on NECT, we were very conscious of the effects of peer-led interventions, but we wanted to offer something that could be available within the professional sector. So we were not looking to replace or supplant what peer-led interventions were able to do in terms of helping people transform their identity from patienthood to personhood. So this was our initial process. After David and I had discussions about what we wanted to do, and then we got Paul involved, we applied for a grant from the United States National Institute of Mental Health. It was something called an Exploratory Intervention Development Grant. After we got that, we each worked on our different sections of the manual that we had conceptualized was going to have these different components. Then we had weekly conference calls. So this was before Zoom. We were talking on the phone, and we discussed parts of the manual that were working well or not. We each piloted it in our own location. So we each started to do it. We edited it quite a bit based on our experiences. We all had different experiences, but they were all seen as important. And then we had consultants review it. So Bruce Link, whose name we've mentioned, is a sociologist, reviewed it. Peggy Schwarbrick, who's a person with lived experience, who's a big part of the movement in New Jersey, it had also contributed. Then we used the revised manual for a pilot randomized controlled trial. At the same time, David had it translated into Hebrew, and there was a quasi-experimental study that was done in Israel where that brought in a lot of new insight. And so we re-revised the manual based on the experience from both of these implementations. And so that brought us to the kind of original full version of the manual. That's the 20-session group intervention with three elements: psychoeducation, cognitive restructuring, and storytelling exercises. There have been some adaptations that have been done since then that shorten it to some extent, but the original version was this 20-session version. So David will say a little bit about why the narrative part is so important to the intervention.
Narratives generally are important in recovery, and actually the basis of psychotherapy in a way in which people talk and share different aspects with the therapist. And the assumption is that the way people experience the world and experience themselves, and in a way the impact of different translate and understand the impact of different events on their life is through stories. We live through stories. When somebody asks us how we are and we answer, we're telling a story about how we are that day. Different people can ask us the same question and we may have different answers because different times of the day, and depending on who asks, the degree of interest and the degree of intimacy with that person, will share different stories. And stories is a way to both organize, a natural way in which we organize our experiences and also communicate them. And so it's a powerful way in which we perceive and actually experience ourselves through the stories that we develop. And also stories are flexible, they change over time. And the way we often try to make sense out of different incidences is through stories, the creating of stories. Beyond the personal level in which a person, especially a person with mental illness, who is often told their story, or not to say dictated their story, for example, as a schizophrenic who, once a schizophrenic, always a schizophrenic, is one famous, terrible example of the history. So beyond the story that so often was conveyed and which was also encouraged to believe in a very limited and narrow way, as sometimes, not always, but sometimes at its extreme, insight sort of manifested because it's a specific way of understanding things in which people with lived experience were expected and encouraged or even reinforced to adapt and internalize. So even the sense of feeling entitled to your own story and being able to construct your own story has a great deal of importance and meaning. And beyond the individual, also as a community, and this is true about different marginalized and stigmatized communities, one's personal identity, as Phil described earlier about the degree to which you identify with different groups and the stigma directed towards it, it really depends on how the degree to which groups internalize or reject and fight back on stories that often try to reinforce or sustain power struggles or oppression. And therefore, as especially people with psychosis and schizophrenia, in which there's such a long history of a very pessimistic outview, the story is not only of the individual, it's a story of a movement of people, of people who have some degree of similar experiences and yet can have, and research has consistently shown to have, a wide range of outcomes. And so stories are fundamental in the recovery of a personal sense of self and identity as well as that of a community.
So with this intervention that we developed, there have now been 5 published controlled studies that have been done. And it started with our small randomized controlled trial in the US, and then a quasi-experimental study that was done in Israel, then the larger randomized control trial that was conducted in Gothenburg, a larger one we did in the US, and then another randomized control trial that was done in Taiwan. So based on these studies, there's been consistent evidence for positive effects on self-stigma and self-esteem that allows us to say that NECT is an evidence-based practice because findings come from more than 2 independent randomized control trials. So that's kind of a common criterion for that. This is just a meta-analysis that was done by folks that we don't know in Malaysia, and they basically looked at different interventions targeting internalized stigma among people who have schizophrenia spectrum disorder diagnoses, and they found that NECT had this consistent moderate to large effect size 0.5, which is a meaningful number for researchers. Interestingly, their effect size computation didn't include the 2 most recent RCTs. So this is based on only those first 3 that I mentioned. A little bit about the scope of NECT implementation. These are places where it's been implemented to our knowledge. Through North America and much of Europe and Middle East and some places in Asia. We are there may be places where NECT has been implemented that we aren't aware, but these are the places where that we know of. I was recently contacted about an initiative in Chile, so I'm interested in learning more about what they've been doing there. And so to try to help distribute information on NECT for places that are interested in implementing it, we created this website where we have manuals, articles, links to articles, links to training videos, meetings that we've held, all kind of available for free. So if you're interested in implementing NECT, please go there. Regarding the Swedish manual specifically, we don't have the manuals uploaded on the NECT Global site, but there is a link to the web page that houses them. Please reach out if you have questions about how you can get access to the Swedish versions of the manual. The manual has been translated into 12 languages, or it's in 12 languages to our knowledge. The most recent translation was Italian. And this is just, some of the covers of the manual. So this was the original or English manual. This was the cover of the Swedish manual. I imagine it still looks like this. Maybe you know some of these folks that were in the photo. This was the Hebrew version. It's translated into French, into Spanish, Mandarin, as it was implemented in Taiwan. And this is the cover for the Italian translation. And this is a version that was adapted for young adults in Canada. And so a lot of the language was changed. It's called Discovering Our Best Selves, but it's still essentially the same version. This is a 14-session version of the manual. So the conclusions we have about NECT is that it's effective. It seems to work wherever you do it. It didn't really change in effectiveness when it was done in Israel or Sweden or Taiwan. Generally, it has the same kind of moderate effect size on self-esteem and self-stigma. It seems to work better when it's compared to, if you compare it to an active control group, it seems to work better when there's a lower intensity service setting, so more like outpatient settings than places where people already have a lot of groups. It seems to be robust to translation and cultural context, and that's encouraging. I was really encouraged to see how it seemed to be essentially the same intervention when implemented in Pakistan. Quite a different cultural context from the U.S. where it was started. Something about what is coming up next. So we've recently completed a adaptation for youth who'd experienced the first episode of psychosis here in U.S. with Bethany Leonhardt acting as the co-investigator in Indianapolis. And this included a 4-session family psychoeducation component concurrently with family members and guardians with the permission of the youth. So that's something that we published a paper on the adaptation, and we're planning to submit a paper soon about findings from the study. There's a study that's recently been completed in Canada of the Discovering Our Best Selves adaptation that I mentioned for youth with bipolar disorder and other mental health conditions. In this adaptation, groups were co-led by peer facilitators. There's a qualitative paper that I'm helping with that I already saw that had some really exciting findings with regard to this. So look out for papers on that. And there's a multi-site clinical trial being done for the Italian translation of the NECT manual that's happening currently. Some future directions, David maybe can speak to this.
Yep. I just maybe say one more thing about what Phil just presented is also about, he shared and talked a little bit about the project that he is leading with the young adults and how important it is, especially with something like self-stigma, to try to capture it as early on as possible to try to prevent the long-term consequences of it. So just as there's been growing emphasis in general of early intervention, seems particularly important for people with a label as stigmatized as a mental illness, and therefore it just seems from our accumulating work that often so much effort is to deal and to try to help people overcome some of the aftermath of not only dealing with their illness but also with some of the treatment experiences in treatment, which not all of them are pleasant. Some can be quite traumatic, and the ongoing stigmatization, that it's important to try to reach people at as young stage as possible. As far as some future things, the development of technology, Phil mentioned earlier how our initial calls of developing the NECT were over the phone before Zoom. And as the world is changing and technology is, whether we like it or not, is rapidly developing, along with some of the price we pay for that, there's also some advantages. And it's also a lot of teaching today is done, parts of it at least online, and different ways to develop tools that can help the practice and the development of the set of skills need to not only train people in different interventions like NECT, but also to practice the skills for the participants themselves. So these are some things that Phil and I have been talking about and have some plans for the future. And it's also another thing that anybody who has experience working in the mental health system knows that one of the most puzzling and frustrating things is that so few of the people who could potentially benefit from treatment actually attend. And the question is, how can we be more user-friendly and increase and engage people so that they will overcome the barriers, which some of them as professionals we certainly contributed to over the years in our culture and the way we delivered services and the natures of services that we often delivered, in order to increase an easy access and less stigmatizing settings in which these interventions can be implemented in. And finally, as Phil pointed out, NECT has been implemented in quite a few different cultures, and those who were accompanied their implementation process with research have consistently shown positive findings. Actually, Phil and I have both been in Sweden more than once in different trainings and so on. And I think Sweden was one of the first places that recognized NECT formally in their guidelines as an evidence-based practice about 10 years ago. There have been relatively few studies which have systematically studied the adjustment to different cultures and settings. And it would be interesting to go more deeply into that and to see how these issues, particularly of those of identity and sense of self, which emerge and develop and are sustained within a social context, actually develop and manifest themselves and could be overcome differently in different contexts and settings. So these are some of the things that we're thinking of for the future.
Yeah, and I think the Canadian study now, I think, will help us understand how well the inclusion of a peer co-facilitator, might impact or magnify the impact of NECT, right? So it's something that we've always felt was very consistent with our vision and our values. It just was something we didn't require because we felt that that might limit the implementation opportunities for it, since we wanted to have it be something that could be offered anywhere, and not every place has peer specialists, working. So, but I think it'd be interesting to see if that enhances the impact of the intervention. Certainly the things said in the qualitative paper would suggest that, but we'll see that in the quantitative outcomes as well. So that is our presentation. So now we have time for questions. So we did pretty well with being on time, David.